A regular man was living his life when, out of nowhere, things took a turn he never saw coming. One evening, he was walking home from work, minding his own business, when a police car suddenly pulled up beside him. Without warning, several officers jumped out, surrounding him. He was confused, even startled, as the officers firmly told him he was being arrested. There was no explanation given at first. The man, still in a daze, asked why he was being detained. But the officers simply told him to stay quiet. At that moment, the man didn't know whether this was some sort of mistake, or if he had done something wrong without realizing it. His mind raced, trying to piece together any possible reason for this arrest. Had he broken any laws? Did he look suspicious? But nothing seemed to add up. He had no criminal history. He had no reason to be involved in anything illegal. But still, here he was, facing a group of officers with no idea what was going on. As the officers guided him toward the police car, they didn't offer him any kind of explanation. The man kept asking questions, but his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. They didn't explain why they were arresting him or even what the charge was. It felt like he was caught up in something bigger than he could comprehend. Was this some sort of mistake? He tried to remain calm, but fear and confusion were creeping in. The man was then placed in the back of the police car. The door slammed shut, and the car started moving. The siren wailed as they drove through the streets, but the man's thoughts were racing faster than the car could go. He looked out the window, still hoping for some answer, but none came. He tried to stay calm, but the uncertainty of the whole situation was unsettling. What had he done wrong? He was just an ordinary person, no different from anyone else. Why were they taking him away? When they arrived at the station, the officers didn't explain anything further. They simply took him inside, and he was placed in a holding cell. The lights flickered overhead, and the cold concrete walls seemed to close in around him. The room was empty, save for a hard bench and a metal toilet. It wasn't a place for anyone to feel comfortable. The man sat down on the bench, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why had the police detained him? Was this some kind of mistake? His mind began to race through every possible explanation. He thought back to the day he had. It had been a normal day. No arguments, no confrontations, nothing out of the ordinary. He had gone to work, helped a few customers, and taken his usual route home. Nothing about his day suggested that he would be arrested. And yet, here he was, locked up with no answers. Minutes turned into hours, but still, there was no word from the officers. Naman's mind kept running through different scenarios. Now maybe they were investigating something larger, and somehow he had gotten caught up in it. Now maybe someone had mistaken him for someone else. Maybe the police had arrested the wrong person. But the more he thought about it, the more questions he had and the fewer answers he could come up with. After a while, the man began to feel helpless. He thought about his family. What would they think when they found out he had been arrested? Would they be worried? Would they be angry at him for something he hadn't even done? He felt a sinking feeling in his stomach, the kind of fear that comes when you know you've been caught in something you didn't deserve. As time passed, he wondered if anyone outside knew he was there. What was the process? Would anyone care? To find out the truth. His name echoed in his head, and he began to wonder if they had confused him with someone else. Maybe the officers had arrested him by mistake. That had to be it. It made no sense that he could be guilty of anything. He had a clean record. There was nothing in his past to suggest he would be detained. It was like his entire life had been turned upside down in an instant. He kept replaying the moments leading up to the arrest in his mind, trying to figure out if he had done something wrong. Was there a misunderstanding? Maybe someone had falsely accused him of something. The longer he sat there, the more uncertain he became. He couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was off. He wasn't supposed to be here. There had to be a reason for all of this, but he had no clue what it was. The cold of the cell seemed to seep into his bones as he sat there, waiting. The quiet made it even worse, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his fears. And still, there was no word. No one came to explain anything to him. It felt like an eternity, and every minute that passed only added to the man's growing sense of confusion and dread as he sat in the silence. He couldn't help but wonder what the officers knew that he didn't. What was their purpose? Why? Had they arrested him? The unknown stretched out before him, and all he could do was wait. Every second felt heavier than the last, and still no one came to offer him answers. What was going to happen next? Inside the cold, sterile walls of the police station, the man found himself sitting alone in a small, dimly lit holding cell. The only sound was the occasional hum of the overhead lights and the faint murmur of voices from the officers outside. It felt like an eternity since they had first detained him, and still, no one had come to explain why he was there. His thoughts were racing, and his nerves were starting to fray. He couldn't help but replay the strange events over and over in his head. What had just happened? Why was he sitting in this cell when he had done nothing wrong? Minutes turned to hours, but nothing changed. The silence in the room was deafening, and the more he sat, the more the uncertainty gnawed him. He had asked the officers repeatedly why he was being arrested, but they had remained tight-lipped, offering him no explanation. The lack of communication only intensified his anxiety. Was this some kind of mistake? Had they confused him with someone else? His mind kept spiraling, trying to come up with any explanation for his sudden detainment. But the truth remained elusive. It was then that he decided he had to take matters into his own hands. If no one was going to tell him what was going on, he would find out himself. He stood up from the hard bench and paced the small cell, trying to gather his thoughts. He had to stay calm, but the frustration was starting to build. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, and the weight of the situation was beginning to settle in. If he had made some kind of mistake, he needed to know what it was. He had to prove his innocence, even if no one was offering him a chance. After what felt like an eternity, a door at the end of the hallway opened, and a figure appeared in the doorway. The officer who entered looked at him briefly, then gestured for him to follow. Finally, he thought, someone was going to explain what was happening. He followed the officer down the narrow corridor, his heart pounding in his chest. As they walked, the man couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. What were they going to tell him? Would he finally get some answers? The officer led him to a small room where another officer sat at a desk, flipping through some paperwork. The man was told to sit down, and he did so, trying to remain composed. But inside, his mind was racing with questions. The officer at the desk didn't look up immediately, continuing to flip through the papers in front of him as if the man's presence didn't matter. "Why am I here?" The man asked again, his voice trembling slightly. "What did I do?" The officer finally looked up, and for a moment, their eyes met. The officer said nothing at first, just stared at the man with an almost blank expression. The tension in the room grew heavier with each passing second. "You're being held for questioning." The officer finally replied, "Until we figure this out, you're not going anywhere." Questioning about what? The man's frustration was evident now, but the officer remained calm, unshaken by the urgency in the man's voice. "There's no need to get upset," the officer said, trying to calm him down. "You'll be informed of everything soon enough." He then turned his attention back to the papers on his desk, leaving the man in an even deeper state of confusion. The room was silent again, and the man couldn't help but feel like he was trapped in some sort of nightmare. It was like he was stuck in a place where answers didn't exist, where no one was willing to shed any light on his situation. The officer's lack of explanation only made him feel more like a pawn in someone else's game. He could feel his frustration building with each second that ticked by. He wanted to demand answers, but he knew he had to remain calm. If he could just understand why this was happening, he might be able to make sense of it all. But no one was offering him that chance. The officer at the desk finally set the papers aside and stood up. "You're not going to be here long," he said, almost as if he were reassuring himself more than the man. "We just need to run a few checks. Once we get everything sorted out, you'll be free to go." The man nodded, though he was far from convinced. What did he mean by checks? What was being checked, and why was it taking so long? He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on than what he was being told. The officer walked out of the room, leaving the man alone again. This time, the silence felt even more oppressive. He was no closer to finding out what had happened or why he was being held. The uncertainty of his situation was driving him to the edge. He was no criminal, no danger to anyone. Yet here he was, in a cold, lonely room with no answers in sight. As the minutes ticked by, the man's mind began to wander again. What if this wasn't a simple mistake? What if they were looking for something that wasn't even connected to him? Could this whole situation be part of a bigger plan? Something he couldn't even begin to understand. The more he thought about it, the more the questions piled up, but no answers came. He had no choice but to wait. All he could do was sit and wonder what was happening to him, and why was he the one caught in the middle of it all? As the hours dragged on, the man's patience began to wear thin. The initial confusion had turned into frustration, and the silence in the holding cell only amplified his growing sense of helplessness. The police hadn't said a word since their initial detainment, and he was left alone to stew in his thoughts. What was going on? Why had he been singled out like this? He had tried to stay calm, but every minute that passed felt like an eternity. Just when he thought he couldn't take the uncertainty any longer, the door to his cell opened again. This time, it wasn't just a single officer entering, but two. One of them carried a clipboard. The other seemed to be taking notes. The man's heart skipped a beat finally. Someone was going to explain what was going on. But as the officers approached, they didn't immediately address him. Instead, they began speaking to each other as if he wasn't even there. "Have you run his background check yet?" one of the officers asked, glancing over at the other. "Yeah, I've got the results right here," the second officer replied, holding up a piece of paper. Nothing unusual, no criminal history at all. "His name checks out, but there's something odd here." The first officer frowned. "Odd how?" "There's a name match," the second officer explained. "But it's not this guy's name. It's someone else's, someone with a pretty serious criminal record." The first officer raised an eyebrow. "You sure it's the same person?" "Yeah, it's the exact same name. But I don't see how it could be him. I mean, this guy's clean as a whistle. He's got no charges against him, nothing." The officer paused for a moment before adding, "But there's no denying the coincidence. The guy we're looking for shares the exact name." The conversation seemed to hang in the air for a moment, and the man felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. Was this all just a mix-up? Had they arrested him by mistake? His mind raced with possibilities. The officers hadn't mentioned this. Before, could they have been looking for someone else with the same name? Suddenly, one of the officers turned toward him. "We're going to need to check a few more things," he said, his tone more businesslike than before. "Please remain. We'll be back shortly." With that, the officers left, leaving the man alone again. The words they had spoken were echoing in his mind. Name match. But why hadn't they told him this earlier? Why hadn't they mentioned that they might have been looking for someone else? The confusion had grown to new levels, and he felt like he was being pulled in two directions at once. On the one hand, he couldn't believe they'd arrested him by mistake. On the other hand, If they were looking for someone with the same name, could they really be certain he wasn't the person they thought he was? The wait stretched on. The man tried to calm his racing thoughts, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. If this was all a misunderstanding, why hadn't the police cleared it up sooner? Why were they still holding him here? His mind kept spinning in circles, trying to come up with any logical explanation for the situation. But the truth remained just out of reach. Eventually, the officers returned, this time with a stack of papers. The man's heart skipped a beat as they entered the room. Was this the moment they would finally clear everything up? Were they going to tell him the truth about what had really happened? "We've been checking," the officer began, his voice more serious than before. "It turns out you weren't the person we were looking for. The name match was an unfortunate coincidence. We're sorry for the confusion, but there was a misunderstanding." The man felt a rush of relief flood through him. He wasn't the person they had been after. It was just a case of mistaken identity. But then, as the officer continued, something caught his attention. "But there's more," the officer said, glancing at the papers in his hand. "You see, the person we were looking for was involved in some pretty serious criminal activity. They were a part of an operation we've been investigating for months. Your name? It's connected to something bigger than we initially realized." The man's relief quickly turned to confusion once again. What did he mean? How was his name connected to anything criminal? The officer's words left him more puzzled than ever. It seemed that his identity wasn't just a simple case of mistaken identity. There was something about his name, something that tied him to a much larger web of events that he had never been a part of. "We need to verify a few more details," the officer continued, "just to make sure we have the full picture." The man's mind was spinning. This was not the end of the story, not by a long shot. The police may have realized they'd made a mistake in arresting him, but now they were starting to dig into his past. What were they going to find? What did they think they had uncovered? The situation was no longer just about his wrongful arrest. It was about something far bigger. And he had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went as the officers left. Again, the man was left in the same holding cell, his thoughts racing. Who was he really? And what was his connection to the criminal activity they had been investigating? The answers were still elusive, but one thing was clear. The more the police uncovered, the more complicated his situation became. The man sat in his cell, feeling the weight of the situation pressed down on him more with each passing minute. What had started as a simple case of mistaken identity was rapidly becoming something much more complicated. His mind raced as he replayed the officer's words. "Your name ... It's connected to something bigger than we initially realized." He couldn't make sense of it. What was this bigger thing they were referring to? Why had his name been tied to something so serious? The officers had left him alone once again, but this time, the silence felt different. The uncertainty wasn't just about whether or not he was the one they were after. It was now about what they were going to discover. He didn't know if he should be worried or relieved. On the one hand, the fact that they had realized their mistake meant he wasn't the person they had originally thought he was. But on the other hand, the fact that his name was linked to something criminal left him with more questions than answers. After what felt like hours of waiting, the door to his cell finally opened again. This time, it wasn't just a couple of officers walking in. It was the lead detective, a sharp, serious-looking man who walked with purpose. His expression was unreadable, but his presence seemed to carry an air of finality. "We need to talk," the detective said as he entered, his tone businesslike but not unfriendly. "You're not the person we thought you were, but your name still ties you to something important. We've been digging, and we're finding some things that don't quite add up." The man stood up, his heart racing. This wasn't just about the misunderstanding anymore. His name was clearly tied to something larger, and whatever that something was, it was now out of his control. "What do you mean?" the man asked, trying to stay calm despite the growing fear inside him. The detective held up a file, thick with paperwork. "We ran a check, as we said. Your name popped up in connection with a series of high-profile cases as we've been investigating for months. The individual we originally thought was you. He's been linked to several major criminal operations. But as we've dug deeper, we found that your identity is tied to his in ways we weren't expecting." The man was taken aback. This was not what he had imagined when they first arrested him. He had no idea what these officers were talking about. His name connected to criminal cases. He had lived an honest life, had no record, no connections to anything illegal. Yet somehow, his name was now on a file that tied him to a shadowy world he didn't even know existed. "The man we thought was you," the detective continued. "He's known for running a complex network of illegal activities. We can't give you all the details right now, but we're starting to wonder if there's a connection between you, Tiff. Maybe your identity was stolen, or if you were somehow involved in what he was doing." The man's mind spun. He felt dizzy, like the ground beneath him had suddenly given way. Was this really happening? Was there someone out there using his identity for something criminal? Or was there some other connection between him and this person that he couldn't yet understand? The detective's words didn't just reveal a mix-up, they suggested a much darker possibility. "I don't know what you're talking about," the man said, his voice shaky. "I don't know this person, and I have nothing to do with any of this." The detective studied him closely, as if trying to gauge the truth in his words. After a moment of silence, he sighed and sat down across from the man. "Look, I'm not saying you're involved in anything illegal. What we're trying to figure out is how your identity ended up in this mess. We need your help to understand what's really going on." The man was stunned. Help? What could he do? He had no answers. No idea how his name had become tangled up in all of this. All he wanted was to go home, to leave this nightmare behind. But the detective's words suggested that the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. "We've got leads," the detective continued. "We're looking into your background, your history. It's possible that someone else used your identity for these criminal activities, but we need to confirm it. There's more to this than just a case of mistaken identity. We need to know how far this goes." The man's stomach twisted into knots. He had no clue what the detective was talking about, but one thing was clear: his life was no longer his own. He was caught in something far larger than a simple arrest. The question now was, how far would this go? What had he unknowingly walked into, and what were the consequences of being connected to such dangerous operations? As the detective left, the man was left alone again, his mind reeling. His name, once just a symbol of his identity, had become a key to something he could never have imagined. The police were now investigating him in ways he had never anticipated. The true story was just beginning to unfold. And he had no idea where it would lead. The man sat in the cold, dimly lit room, his mind racing as he tried to process everything the detective had just told him. The more he thought about it, the more tangled and complicated his situation seemed. He had gone from being an innocent man detained by mistake to being entangled in a web of criminal activity that he had no part in. The detective's words echoed in his mind. "We need to confirm how far this goes." It felt like his world had been turned upside down, and now, with every passing hour, he was getting deeper into something he didn't understand. It wasn't long before the officers returned. This time, the atmosphere had shifted. There was a sense of urgency in their movements. They didn't speak much as they led him out of the holding cell, but the tension in the air was palpable. The man's heart raced as he followed them through the corridors of the station. He had been hoping for answers, But now, a feeling of dread crept over him. What would they uncover next? What if his life as he knew it was about to change forever? They arrived at a different room this time, one he hadn't seen before. It was smaller, and the walls seemed to close in on him as the door clicked shut. Behind them, the officers didn't sit at first. They stood in front of him, their eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him feel even more exposed than he already was. For a moment, no one spoke. The lead officer, the one who had first interrogated him, stepped forward and placed a thick file on the table between them. "We've been running checks, following up on leads," he began. "And we've found something." That's single quotes. Unusual. The person we thought was you, the one connected to those criminal activities, wasn't just someone using your name. It looks like there's a deeper connection here, and it involves you. The man's pulse quickened. His body went cold as the officer continued. "It appears that the person we were originally looking for, he wasn't just hiding behind your identity. Your personal information, your details, were somehow linked to his operations. We don't know how yet, but we're certain now that this isn't just an accidental match." The man's stomach twisted. How could this be happening? His name, his identity, was now tied to something so far beyond anything he had ever imagined. He had lived a simple life, worked hard, followed the rules. Yet somehow, someone had managed to use his identity for something dark and dangerous. But who? How? And why hadn't he known anything about it? The officer continued, his voice becoming more urgent. "Your name has shown up on multiple documents, accounts, addresses, even transactions connected to this criminal network. We don't know how they were able to access your information, but we believe someone has been using your details for years. The question now is, were you targeted, or did you unknowingly play a part in this yourself?" The man's head was spinning. He couldn't keep up with what the officer was saying. He was struggling to understand how his personal details could be connected to such serious criminal activities. He felt betrayed by his own identity, like something that was supposed to define him had been hijacked for a purpose he couldn't even comprehend. "I swear, I've never been involved in anything like this," the man insisted, his voice trembling. "I don't know what's going on. I'm not the person you're looking for. I've never done anything wrong." The officer nodded slowly, as if he understood the man's frustration, but his expression remained serious. "We believe you. But the problem is, we have evidence that suggests otherwise. It's not about whether you've committed a crime, at least not yet. The bigger question is, why does your identity keep showing up in these operations? And more importantly, who's been using your details all this time?" The air in the room felt thick with tension. The man's thoughts were racing, but his mind couldn't catch up with the gravity of the situation. His name was being linked to serious crimes, but he had no idea how or why. Was it possible that someone had stolen his identity and was using it for illegal purposes? Or was there a deeper connection between him and this criminal network that he hadn't yet uncovered? For the first time, the man felt truly powerless. The detectives were no longer just trying to figure out if he was the person they had originally thought he was. Now, they were trying to figure out how his life had become entangled in something so dangerous. It wasn't just a matter of clearing his name, it was about uncovering a hidden truth he had never even suspected. The officer's voice cut through his thoughts. "We're going to need your full cooperation. We need to track down whoever is behind this, and the only way we can do that is by understanding how you're connected. Do you have any idea who might want to use your identity?" The man shook his head, feeling a knot form in his throat. "No, I have no idea. I don't know anyone who would do this." The officer looked at him with a mixture of skepticism and sympathy. "We need you to think harder. You've been dragged into something much bigger than you realize. We're going to need to dive deep into your past, your family, your connections. There's more to this, and we need to find out who's been pulling the strings." The man felt a wave of nausea wash over him. This wasn't just about a mix-up anymore. His life had been infiltrated, and the person who had done it was still out there, manipulating things from the shadows. As he looked at the file in front of him, his stomach sank. His identity had become the key to something far more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. And now he was caught in the middle, struggling to find out how deep the rabbit hole really went. The man's mind was overwhelmed, but one thing had become undeniable. The longer he sat there in that sterile room, the more his sense of reality seemed to slip away. What had once been a simple case of mistaken identity had spiraled into something much more sinister. His name wasn't just caught in a random mix-up. It was now attached to criminal networks, illegal transactions, and operations he couldn't even begin to understand. His life had been infiltrated by shadows he couldn't see. And the deeper the police dug, the darker and more tangled the web seemed to become. The detective's words echoed in his mind. There's more to this than just a case of mistaken identity. What had started as a misunderstanding now felt like a nightmare. He had never suspected his name could be connected to such dark corners of the world. But as he sat in the interrogation room, one truth stood clear. Whoever had stolen his identity or somehow linked him to these criminal activities had been playing a dangerous game. And he was now caught in the middle, just when he thought. The situation couldn't get any more bizarre. The detective walked in again. This time, there was something different in his demeanor, a mix of caution and urgency. The man's heart pounded in his chest as the detective placed a new set of documents on the table between them. He could feel the weight of those papers pressing down on him, like the truth was finally going to emerge. But it was one he wasn't prepared for. "We've been running a deeper analysis," the detective said, his voice low, almost as if he didn't want anyone else to overhear. "We've connected your name to multiple people, including some who have been under surveillance for years. This is more than just a case of identity theft, much more complex." The man leaned forward, his breath caught in his throat, his stomach twisted. What did he mean by more complex? Was it possible that someone had used his name to infiltrate these criminal circles on purpose? Or was there a deeper connection between him and these individuals that went beyond a simple stolen identity? The detective continued, flipping through the files, his eyes scanning the contents. "What we're seeing here suggests that this wasn't an accident. You've been listed as a participant in some of these operations, not just a victim of stolen identity. But here's where it gets strange. We found documents files that show you in places you don't remember being, involved in things you don't recall. These aren't just random matches anymore. They're linked to major figures in the criminal world." The man felt a chill run down his spine. His memory began to betray him, and doubt seeped in. Was there something about his past he couldn't recall? Had he really been involved in something he didn't know about? The detective's words were like a fog clouding his thoughts. He struggled to grasp the situation. How could this be happening? To him, the detective continued to speak, but his words felt distant, muffled. "We're not accusing you of anything yet, but we need to understand your connection to these people. We've already questioned some of them, and they've linked your name to key meetings, key events. Your name keeps coming up, and this isn't just a coincidence." The man's heart thudded louder. His hands gripped the edge of the table. "I don't understand. I've never been part of anything like that," he said, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would make the nightmare even more real. The detective paused, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward. "We've traced the origins of these files back to someone with your name, but not you. This individual has been using a series of aliases to hide in plain sight. The files suggest you've crossed paths with this person, or maybe you've been used to further their plans without even knowing it." The man's head spun. What was the detective implying? that someone had been living his life while he was left in the dark. How could someone else be using his name like that? And if so, what did they want from him? It didn't make sense. If someone had been using his identity, how had they managed to cover their tracks so thoroughly? How had they manipulated everything without him noticing? The detective sat back in his chair, staring at the man with a mix of sympathy and frustration. We're getting closer to the truth, but the answers are still hidden. We need to know where you were, who you were with, and what you've been involved in. It's the only way to track down the person behind this and figure out how deep this really goes. The man could feel the walls closing in on him. His past, his entire life, was suddenly up for examination. Every step he had ever taken, every moment he had lived, seemed to be under the microscope. His mind raced, trying to recall details, places he'd been, people he'd met, conversations he'd had. Had he been followed? Had he unknowingly walked into something dangerous? The more he thought, the more the fear began to build inside him. I don't know what's happening. I've never done anything illegal in my life, he said, his voice shaking. The detective's eyes softened for a moment, but then the hard edge returned. We believe you. But the reality is, your name is now part of something much larger than you. Whether you like it or not, you've been dragged into a web of lies, manipulation, and deceit. And until we uncover who's behind it all, we can't rule out the possibility that you've been used as a pawn. The words hit the man like a ton of bricks. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was entangled in a game he didn't even know existed. His name had become the key to something he couldn't understand. And the more the police uncovered, the more questions they raised. Who was behind this? Why had they targeted him? And most importantly, what did they want from him? The truth was just out of reach, but with every new piece of information, the puzzle grew darker and more terrifying. The man's world had become a labyrinth of confusion and fear. And as the days passed, the reality of what he was facing sank deeper. The investigation had turned his life upside down, dragging him into a tangled web of deception. And now, the final pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. What had started as an innocent mistake had spiraled into a full-scale investigation. One that was revealing more about his life than he could have ever imagined. The question was no longer how he had been connected to these criminals, it was why. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the detective returned. This time, there was no hesitation in his step, no unease. He walked into the room with a sense of finality. The door closed behind him, and the man's heart pounded in his chest. The silence that had followed him through every interrogation had only deepened the weight of his situation, but now it felt different. This was the moment he had been dreading, when everything would either make sense or shatter beyond repair. "We've pieced everything together," the detective said, his voice cold but resolute. "We know who is behind this, and we know how you were involved." The man's breath hitched. His throat was dry, his hands clammy. He was terrified of hearing the truth, yet at the same time, he knew he needed it. The truth would either free him or imprison him further. The detective continued, his eyes meeting the man's. "The individual who used your identity, the one who orchestrated this entire scheme, was someone from your past. A person you knew long ago, someone you trusted. It was a betrayal, and you never saw it coming. He had been living in the shadows, using your name to create a life for himself, life of crime, manipulation, and deceit. The whole time, you thought you were living your life normally, but your identity was being siphoned away. It was all part of his plan." The man's mind reeled. He couldn't comprehend what the detective was saying. Someone I knew. Who could it have been? His thoughts spun, searching through his past, but no face stood out. It was impossible. He had always been careful. He had no enemies, no history of betrayal. But the detective's words made it clear. Someone had been hiding in his life, using him as a stepping stone for their own agenda. "He's been using your identity for years," the detective continued, working from the shadows, keeping everything under the radar until it was time to strike. And now, with the investigation closing in on him, he's disappeared. He's gone, just like that. The man's heart dropped. It didn't make sense. How could someone so close to him be behind all of this? He had lived his life, believing that the people around him were trustworthy, but now he was left questioning everything. His own identity had been hijacked without his knowledge. And the person who had done it was someone he had once known. He had trusted. It was like a nightmare, one he couldn't escape. "But why me?" the man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why my name?" The detective's expression softened, but only slightly. "Because your life was clean. You were invisible. No criminal record, no complications, just a regular guy. He needed someone with a life like yours to hide in. Someone who wouldn't raise suspicion. It's a perfect cover. He used you, and you never even knew it. But we're closing in on the operation now. We've got leads, and we'll find him." The words barely registered in the man's mind. He was still reeling from the revelation. His identity, his entire life, had been stolen from him, manipulated into something dark and criminal. He felt like a stranger in his own skin. The person he thought he was had been erased, replaced by a version of himself created for someone else's gain. The detective paused, then added, "But you're not alone in this anymore. The investigation will continue, and we'll make sure you're cleared of any wrongdoing. You've been a victim in all of this, just as much as anyone else. We'll help you get your life back." The man sat back in his chair, his mind still whirling. There was a sense of relief, knowing that the police were finally closing in on the person responsible, but it didn't erase the pain of what had been done to him. His life had been turned into a weapon, a tool used by someone else for their own malicious purposes. How could he ever rebuild from this? How could he trust anyone again? The detective stood, preparing to leave. "We're not done yet, but we're on the right path. We'll update you on the progress, and in time, you'll get the justice you deserve." With that, the detective left the room, leaving the man alone once again. But this time, it felt different. The weight on his shoulders hadn't lifted entirely, but there was a flicker of hope. He wasn't the one at fault here. The truth had been uncovered, and the person who had destroyed his life would eventually face the consequences. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the path to reclaiming his own life. As he sat in the silence of the room, the man realized something he hadn't been able to before: his identity. The thing that had been taken from him would not define his future. He would rebuild. He would fight back. The shadows of his past had tried to consume him, but in the end, they would not have the last word. The case would soon close, but for him, the journey had just begun.